Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to the third lecture of Unit 2, Reconstruction. Thus far, in Unit 2, we've addressed the challenges of Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction, attempts at achieving equality for the African Americans, and the Southern defiance that resulted from those attempts. Our focus today will be on Congress and their attempt to take over Reconstruction and how they would lead it completely differently than the presidents did. You see, the South, to this point, had every opportunity to get off Reconstruction fairly easily, but that was about to change. The Republicans were not really happy with how the South was being defiant, and they were about to take some actions to prevent the South from attempting to keep things the way that they always had been. Republicans in Congress were mightily upset, pretty angry that the South, after the Civil War, the reconstructed South, was fairly, if not exactly similar to the pre-Civil War South. And when they gained a two-thirds majority in the House and Senate, this was going to change everything completely, because now they had the power to block President Johnson's vetoes and his plans. And it would completely change the direction of Reconstruction. The radical Republicans began to get more involved, and their whole goal was equality for African Americans. And they were led by two men, Charles Sumner in the Senate and Thaddeus Stevens in the House. And again, I want to reiterate that things were going to be completely different. They were fed up and upset with what the South had been doing and the South's lack of concern and lack of attempt to abide by what was supposed to happen after the Civil War. Now, Thaddeus Stevens had a plan to take land away from wealthy landowners and give it to former slaves. And this was pretty radical. And the rest of the Republicans were not ready to go this far, but they did take some significant action. And the first thing that they did was they passed the Civil Rights Bill in 1866, a very significant bill that was necessary in the first place because of the Dred Scott decision in the 1850s. Now you see, Dred Scott was a former slave who had lived in free territory for a period of time, then moved back and forth between free and slave territory, and eventually he sued for his freedom. And the significance of this case was in the ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that slaves were not citizens of the United States. And so that was going to be a big issue after the Civil War, is whether or not slaves or African Americans were citizens. And so the Civil Rights Bill and eventually the 14th Amendment were going to be an attempt to fix the problem created by the Dred Scott decision. So the Civil Rights Bill defined persons born in the United States as citizens and established nationwide equality before the law. Now, Andrew Johnson, obviously a blatant racist, was not going to support this, and so he vetoed it. But here we see the significance of the two-thirds number in Congress that the Republicans held now, and they were able to override this veto. And it was the first time in history, United States history, that a presidential veto had been overridden by Congress. And believe me, it would not be the last. And the reason why Johnson vetoed it, he claimed, listen to how absurd this is, that protecting the rights of African Americans resulted in discriminating against whites. The radical Republicans were not happy with only the Civil Rights Bill, and so they decided to take it even further and put it into the United States Constitution in form of the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship, guarantees equal protection under the law, extends the rights in the Bill of Rights to all the states, and also forbids ex-Confederates from holding office. The southern states initially refused to ratify this. Okay? And the 14th Amendment had no support from Democrats, but the radical Republicans found out a way to deal with that. They refused to seat Southern Democrats that had been elected to Congress, and this is what allowed the 14th Amendment to pass. And eventually, under military Reconstruction, which we'll get to shortly, the Southern states were required to ratify the 14th Amendment in order to be allowed back into the Union. What occurred next was military Reconstruction. This is where radical Reconstruction really begins. The South, being as defiant as it had been, like I told you before, had greatly irritated the North and the Republicans. And so they took drastic measures here, and just think about how different this is than presidential Reconstruction. Complete 100% different. Okay? The South was divided into 5 military districts occupied by Northern troops. Each state would be required to form a new government, which included participation by black men, and they were forced to ratify the 14th Amendment. Okay? And this would be the way Reconstruction would continue for quite some time. This would be a very good thing for African Americans. Their rights would be guaranteed. A big part of this was to do away with the black codes, the 14th Amendment and this military Reconstruction. But it was not going to help the South get over the war, because they were going to be occupied by Northern troops for the next several years. And the troops were going to be there, a constant reminder to the Civil War and how the Civil War had been lost by the South and so forth. Here you can see a map of the military districts. And I want you to take a look at military district number 3, which included Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And just guess who the Union general put in charge of that district was. None other than William Tecumseh Sherman, who had been responsible for destroying much of Georgia on his march to the sea. And so I'm sure the Georgians were very happy about that. Well, Congress, the radical Republicans, were not happy with their ability to simply override the vetoes of President Johnson. These two, Johnson and Congress, did not see eye to eye on basically anything. And so Congress attempted to impeach Andrew Johnson. That's when you remove an elected official from office. They kind of set Johnson up. Johnson was not a great president. He's actually a pretty poor president. But he really did not deserve to be impeached. I'll tell you how it happened. He continued to veto their legislation, and so they realized that if they were able to get rid of him, since he had taken over for Abraham Lincoln, that they'd be able to choose the next president, basically. And so what they did was they passed this law called the Tenure of Office Act, which prevented a president from firing any appointee that he had appointed that needed congressional approval to take their office. And this basically meant cabinet members. Johnson kept most of Lincoln's cabinet members, and one of them was Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War. And so what Stanton did was do everything possible he could to get fired. Johnson fired him, and for this they tried to remove him from office. Presidents have done many things over the years that probably deserved some level of impeachment proceedings. Obviously, we talked about Andrew Jackson in the past. Bill Clinton was brought up on impeachment charges. Richard Nixon resigned as a result of the Watergate scandal. But this was a political attempt to remove a president from office. So they went through the process. The House voted to impeach Johnson, but he survived the Senate by 1 vote. They needed 36 votes to remove him from office, and they received 35, which is a good thing. Johnson was not a great president, but this would have set a bad precedent that if Congress didn't like what the president was doing, then there were backwards ways to remove them from office. That's not why the impeachment clause was put into the Constitution. Here's a picture of the impeachment proceedings. Now, in 1868, Johnson was not in any position to be reelected, and so he was not even nominated. The Republicans went with Ulysses S. Grant, the former Civil War general, and he was elected by a narrow margin. And through this, the Republicans maybe thought, if we allowed African Americans to vote, that would probably give us many more votes, because it was a Republican Party that was standing up for the rights for African Americans. And so the 15th Amendment was passed, which prohibited states from denying the right for men to vote based on their race, not their gender, not whether they were literate, not whether their grandfathers had voted. So states found ways to get around this, the southern states. And in many cases, African Americans were prevented from voting. For example, some states passed grandfather clauses, which said if your grandfather had voted, you could vote. Well, obviously, none of the slaves' grandfathers had voted. Poll taxes. In many places, people were forced to pay taxes, and the African Americans, the former slaves, could not afford this. But probably the biggest way that they prevented African Americans from voting were literacy tests. And states passed these. Most southern states passed these. Some of them, the Alabama one, for example, was 60 questions, and they were government questions based on the Constitution or so forth. You had 15 minutes to take the test, and if you missed one, that constituted failure. You had to take these tests if you could not prove that you had a 5th grade education, which none of them had. And so obviously this also applied to some poor whites. But it did achieve their goal of skirting the 15th Amendment. But there were some also, over 2,000 African Americans were elected as a result of the 15th Amendment. You had the first African American governor, Pinckney B.S. Pinchback of Louisiana, elected in 1872. He would later go on to serve in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. And the next African American governor would be Douglas Wilder of Virginia, elected in 1989, which is absolutely astonishing, I believe. So the 15th Amendment provided African Americans the right to vote in some areas, but in most cases, this was the situation. As time went on in Reconstruction, the Republicans kind of lost interest. There were economic issues that were occurring, economic recessions, and this was costing a substantial amount of money to keep the troops in the South and all of the actions that they were taking with military reconstruction. But they attempted one final act here to help African Americans out before Reconstruction ended. This was a Civil Rights Act of 1875, because what was occurring here was segregation. The blacks were being prevented from going to certain areas. So under the Civil Rights Act of 1875, it was a crime for any individual to deny access to public places, such as buildings, trains, hotels, restaurants. And eventually this would go to the Supreme Court with Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court would rule that segregation was constitutional. So the Supreme Court completely dropped the ball in their first challenge dealing with the 14th Amendment. And basically this would result in the next 100 years until Martin Luther King would come along of more racism and discrimination and prevention of equality for African Americans. This concludes our third lecture for Unit 2. In the fourth and final lecture, we'll take a look at how Reconstruction came to an end.